Between 1931 and 1941, Japan's foreign policy continued to be defined by radical nationalism and militarism. This led to intervention in China, which then led to a deteriorating relationship with the West in the 1930s, which ultimately then led to Pearl Harbor and a global war. Here's a quick overview of the key events that occurred after the Manchurian Crisis. Of course, it first starts with the bombing at the Mukden incident and then moves on to conquering Manchuria. The League of Nations does send a commission in to investigate. In the meantime, Japan captures Shanghai. By February 1933, the League votes against Japan. Japan leaves. The League does not agree on sanctions and no army is sent. So basically, the League of Nations fails. By 1937, Japan is invading China. By the 1930s, Japan had fully modernized and gone a long way towards achieving equality with the West. The forces of nationalism and militarism were popular with the Japanese people. These forces had been given a boost by successes in wars against China and Russia, which had established Japan's position in mainland China. Most Japanese by the 1930s saw Japan's position in Asia as essential, not only for economic and strategic reasons, but because they believed it was Japan's destiny to be a leader in the region. Throughout the 1930s, the impact of the militarist and nationalist thinking in Japan continued to be important in encouraging an expansionist foreign policy. By the late 1920s, a new situation had emerged in China. It was this situation combined with the growing strength of the military and an economic crisis that led to the Manchurian Crisis of 1931. Encouraged by public outrage concerning the behavior of foreigners in China, Chinese nationalism began to grow. The Nationalist Party in China, or the GMD, led by Chiang Kai-shek, began a campaign of national unification. This included anti-foreigner rhetoric and demands to end the unequal treaties. By 1921, a new political party, the Communist Party, had been set up in China. Initially, the Communists, led by Mao Zedong, joined Kai-shek to form the United Front. The United Front launched a northern expedition to consolidate central government control and wrest powers from the warlords. However, ultimately, the nationalists and the communists were to clash in an all-out civil war, which from 1927 directed the energies and focus of Kai-shek towards defeating the communists rather than the Japanese. This changing situation in China was to have an impact on the actions of the Japanese government and military. The Northern Expedition, which was launched by Kai-shek with the communists, was regarded with some degree of concern by the Japanese government. The Japanese had backed the warlord in Manchuria, Zhang Jialin. However, Zhang had become very powerful and attempted to expand into northern China, which made him a target of Kai-shek. If Kai-shek defeated Zhang, this could impede Japan's special interest in Manchuria. The Japanese government planned to use its army in Manchuria, the Kwantung Army, to disarm Zhang and to force him to retreat back to Manchuria before he was defeated by Kai-shek. This policy was to let Kai-shek have China while Japan focused its interest in Manchuria. However, some of the Kwantung leaders thought that Zhang should not be treated so leniently and decided to take action themselves. First, they forced Kai-shek's northern expedition to halt. Then they assassinated Zhang on June 4, 1928. Some of the Kwantung assassins believed that the fallout from this act would provide the excuse they wanted to conquer Manchuria. Since 1906, the Southern Manchurian Railway had been guarded by the Kwantung Garrison, which in 1919 developed into the Kwantung Army. The Kwantung Army became a stronghold of radical Kudaha, or Imperial Way faction, with many of its leaders advocating the violent overthrow of the civilian government to bring about a military dictatorship. They also advocated a more aggressive and expansionist foreign policy. Japan's Prime Minister Tanaka was instructed by the Emperor to enforce discipline in the army. He was very angry, and despite ordering a punishment, the general staff were unwilling to punish the Kwantung Army. In July 1929, Tanaka was forced to resign. Now a new leader, Hamaguchi, became prime minister in an election in 1930. He didn't have a majority in parliament, but held another election where he won a sound majority on his manifesto of good relations with China, disarmament, and an end to corruption. However, his government soon faltered as an impact from the Great Depression. In the end, in November 1930, he was shot in the head. He survived his injuries to resign in April 1931, but later died in August. The global economic crisis, which started in 1929 following the Wall Street crash in the United States, called into question the whole international economic order. This, in turn, cast doubts on the trustworthiness of the U.S. and other democratic nations, and on Japan's own parliamentary government. Japan was dependent on world trade, and its exports fell drastically as countries put up tariffs to protect their own industries. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, signed into law by President Herbert Hoover in 1930, brought in the highest protective tariffs in U.S. peacetime industry. Duties on Japanese goods rose by as much as 200%. The worst hit industry was the silk industry. By 1932, the price of silk had fallen to less than 1/5 of what it had been in 1923. Farmers were hit particularly badly, since over half of them relied on silk production. The result was desperate poverty as unemployment rose to 3 million. In this dire economic situation, Manchuria became even more important to Japan's interests. Japan had gained control of Port Arthur as well as control of the railway and mineral rights when it defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. Manchuria's wealth of resources, coal, iron, and timber, were increasingly important to Japan, suffering the deprivations of the Depression. If Japan took over Manchuria, it would control these resources and also gain a market for its manufactured goods. Manchuria could also provide living space for an overpopulated Japan. In fact, Manchuria was depicted by the diplomat Yosuke Matsuko, who became foreign minister in 1940, as a lifeline and our only means of survival. It was clear that China under Kai-shek would fight for Manchuria. The hopes of the Kwantung Army to easily seize Manchuria were somehow becoming more difficult now. Thus, a group of Kwantung Army officers hatched a plot to seize Manchuria. The government in Japan was warned of this, and the emperor ordered the Minister of War to restrain the Kwantung Army. The Minister of War responded by writing an urgent letter, which was purposely held back. On the evening of September 18, 1931, near Mukden, there was an explosion on the section of a Japanese-owned South Manchurian Railway. Immediately afterwards, officers of the Kwantung Army claimed that the railway had been blown up by the Chinese. However, there is evidence that the perpetrators were members of the Kwantung Army. The Kwantung Army had its excuse. Within hours, the Japanese had forced the Chinese to retreat from Mukden. The following day, the Kwantung Army entered Cheongchang to the north. Watazuki's government, who was the Prime Minister of Japan, by the way, attempted to regain control and declared a policy of non-expansion of hostilities, but the Kwantung Army was relishing its victories and did not heed the orders coming from Tokyo. It began to seize more territory. On September 24th, the government declared that the army would fall back to the railway zone, but again, the Kwantung Army ignored the government and pushed further into the Manchurian countryside. To the outside world, Japan's proclamations of peaceful intent seemed deceitful as its army continued to expand in Manchuria. The breakdown of control over the Kwantung Army had not been fully appreciated. Thus, there followed in the 1930s a marked deterioration in relations between Japan on the one hand and the U.S. and Britain on the other. Although, as you will see, the West's response to the Manchurian Crisis in 1931 was rather cautious, nevertheless, its condemnation of Japan for using force caused Japan to leave the League of Nations. Following on from this, and as the military gained more power in the 1930s, there was a degree of admiration within Japan for Nazi Germany, which had also walked out of the League of Nations. In contrast, the new Soviet communist regime was both an ideological and territorial threat to Japan, with its interests in Manchuria. By the 1930s, the Japanese viewed the Soviets as their key potential opponent in the region, increasingly concerned by the relationship between China and the Soviet Union. Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany in November 1936. However, it is important to note that unlike Italy and Germany, Japan never had a fascist party leading the government, nor did it abandon elections or cabinet governments even during the Second World War. By the beginning of 1932, Manchuria was wholly under the control of Japanese forces. The Japanese in Manchuria set up an independent government under the puppet rule of Puyi, the last emperor of China, and called the new state Manchukuo. In January 1932, fighting also broke out between Japanese and Chinese forces in Shanghai. The city was bombed by the Japanese with widespread devastation of the Chinese districts. The intense bombing over the densely populated residential area of Taipei, with the thousands of casualties and refugees that were created as a result, intensified Chinese outrage and helped turn world opinion against Japan. 4 divisions of Japanese troops landed to assist the Navy stationed in Shanghai. After 6 weeks, Chinese forces were forced to withdraw. China's response to the Manchurian Crisis was to call the League of Nations. Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of the Nationalist Party, was now focused on defeating the Chinese communists and did not want to get involved in another conflict. He knew that he was unlikely to receive the kind of support he needed from the Western powers, but hoped nevertheless that he could gain time to organize his defenses. He also did not directly negotiate with the Japanese government. This combination of non-resistance, no compromise, and non-direct negotiation was unlikely to benefit China. Although Kai-shek was reluctant to confront Japan directly, the Chinese people responded with fury at Japan's actions. There was a boycott of Japanese products, which had an impact on Japan, as it reduced sales of its goods in China by 2/3. This did little to stop Japan's actions, however, or to change Kai-shek's priorities in dealing with the communists first before dealing with the Japanese. Thus, following the bombing of Shanghai and Japan's continued expansion in the north, China continued to cede territory. Japanese control of Manchuria was accepted in May 1933. Kai-shek further agreed to the seizures of parts of Inner Mongolia, and in June 1935 agreed to remove all troops from the Hebei province. Kai-shek's strategy against Japan derived from his belief that, given the size of China, Japan would exhaust itself in the process of trying to occupy it. He believed that the Japanese were a disease of the skin, while the communists were a disease of the heart. Thus, he considered selling space to buy time a viable strategy. Japan benefited economically from the occupation of Manchuria. However, the cost of maintaining a sizable army on the Chinese mainland to some extent negated the benefits, and there was an increase in taxation back home in Japan. Indeed, by going it alone internationally and also declaring its responsibility for maintaining peace in Asia through the Asian Monroe Doctrine, Japan was potentially overstretching itself. It needed to be able to protect itself against the Soviet Army and the U.S. Navy, and also to make the Chinese government accept its position in Manchuria and northern China. This precarious situation was the result of decision-making by the army rather than the government, and of the nationalist sentiment that had been growing in Japan. Following the Manchurian Crisis, there was little hope that the government would regain the upper hand. Indeed, the Japanese government's position was further undermined by public support for the Kuomintang Army's actions in China. There was a celebration of the heroes of Manchuria. The embarrassed Japanese government had to go along with the wave of popular opinion and accept the conquest rather than demonstrate the loss of control it had over the army. Foreign criticism and condemnation also galvanized Japanese nationalist sentiments. There are three different perspectives regarding war. It could be argued that from the early 1930s, Japan had planned a war with the aim of dominating Asia, which went against U.S. interests. Japan's aims in the region could only be achieved through war. Therefore, war in the region was inevitable. However, it can also be argued that although Japan did plan to expand its empire into Asia, war was not inevitable. They could use negotiation. If possible, war with a major power could be avoided, but if they needed to go to war, they were prepared. In addition, a third argument is that Japan was forced into war by the actions of the United States. Japan had legitimate aims for the region, and the U.S. and Britain were determined to contain Japan.